So before we actually get into taking a look at Selenium in action here, let's talk a little bit about the architecture. Selenium can be a little bit confusing. It can seem like magic is going on when you run the test and it's suddenly automating the browser. And it's not straightforward to how it's doing that. At first glance, it might appear that Selenium is actually driving the browser directly from your code, but there's actually a little bit more going on here, and it's going to help us understand how we can remote execute our tests by looking at this basic architecture. So here's a picture of the architecture for Selenium WebDriver, which is the current version of Selenium that we're talking about in this course. You can see at the top here, we've got some bindings, and these are language level bindings. And what these bindings are just implementations in the various languages that we can use to do our automation. So we have a common API that we use for Selenium that has a common set of commands, and we have various bindings for the different languages. So you can see there's C#, Java, Python, Ruby. There's also some other bindings, and new bindings can be added very easily. Now these bindings communicate across a common API, this WebDriver API. And this is an API that is a standard that is possibly going to be incorporated natively in browsers eventually. At least that's what the Selenium folks are pushing for. Now, let's not worry too much about exactly how this API works at this point, but understand that this API allows us to have some drivers that interpret commands that are sent across that API. So these drivers here at the bottom, you see we have an IE driver, a Firefox, Chrome, a driver called HTML unit, which is an interesting one. It is basically a not real web browser. It's a headless web browser. What I mean by that is it doesn't display any window, it doesn't show you anything, but it is able to respond like a real web browser. So it can make your tests execute quite fast since you don't have that slowdown of any kind of rendering. But the basic idea here is that each one of these drivers knows how to drive the browser that it corresponds to. So the IE driver knows how to use the low-level details of Internet Explorer and drive it to do things like clicking buttons, going to pages, getting data from the browser itself. Same thing with Firefox, Chrome, and so on. And so what's happening here is you're going to write your test in, let's say, C#, and you're going to be using the common Selenium API, and that C# binding is going to be sending commands across this common WebDriver API. Now, on the other end is going to be listening a driver. Whatever driver that you've hooked up, you've specified in your test, is going to listen, it's going to interpret those commands, and it's going to execute them on the actual browser. And then it's going to return the result back up using the WebDriver API to your code where you can look at that result. Let's zoom in a little bit more on how exactly that works. And we're going to look at a real example of this and see some of this code here. But the basic idea here is that you've got your binding code. You're going to write your test, let's say using C# against that Selenium API. And that binding code is going to issue commands across what's called the WebDriver Wire Protocol, which is basically a REST-based web service that is able to interpret those commands. So we can actually even just send HTTP requests, we can send posts and gets to what is a driver server. And this driver server is just a little executable that runs. Each one of the drivers has this driver server that basically listens on a port on your local machine when you run your tests, and it's waiting for these commands to come in. And when these commands come in, it interprets those commands and then automates the browser and then returns those results back. So really, when you're executing your tests locally, you're not really doing a local execution. What you're doing is you're basically sending out commands over this web service, and then a server that's sitting on your machine is catching them and then performing the action and giving you back the results. So this is not apparent when you're running Selenium. It looks like it's just running directly from the code that you're executing. You might not catch that it's actually doing all this over the wire.